The night begins softly here, not with thunder, nor fire, nor the clash of angry gods, but with silence. A silence so deep it hums. A silence shaped like a breath that never fully left the lungs of the divine. That's where the story begins. Not in time, not in place, but in a whisper beneath the stars. Somewhere beyond memory, when the earth was still damp with birth and the stars were newborn embers strung across the black sky like spilled beads, there drifted a voice. Wordless, yet full. A melody of feeling rather than sound. It curled through the trees before there were forests, through the sands before there were deserts, humming against the bones of a world not yet finished. And from this whisper, some say, it was she who came. She had no name then, no feet to tread the soil, no hands to shape the day. She was a pulse, a promise, a hush in the dark heart of the cosmos. The ancestors, those who spoke to fire and bone, believed she was a forgotten echo of Mawu, the great moon mother of the Dahoma pantheon, goddess of light, balance, compassion. But Ayaba, as she would one day be known, was not a daughter born. She was a daughter dreamed. Mawu, they say, once wept not for sorrow, but for the overwhelming beauty of what she had made. The sky, the moon, the rhythm of night. And in one of those tears, falling slowly through time, she dreamed of something more. Something not even she could mold with divinity alone. And so the whisper was born, not of fire or thunder, but of yearning. They say if you lie still enough, so still that even your heartbeat is quiet, you might hear it. Especially in the deep corners of West Africa, where the stars still speak clearly and the winds carry memory. There, in the hush between palm trees and the distant drums of nocturnal creatures, that breath lingers. The breath of a goddess remembering a dream. A breath with the warmth of a lullaby and the weight of prophecy. It was in this breath that Ayaba waited. She was not created. She was not summoned. She was remembered. Some elders, now old as earth and twice as quiet, believe that Ayaba's soul circled the moon for 1,000 years before it ever touched flesh. That she wandered between dreams, peering into the minds of sleeping women. Women who prayed for peace, for strength, for justice, for love. She gathered those wishes like seeds in her palm. She watched, she listened. And when she had seen enough, when the world had forgotten enough of the old songs, she descended. But not like a falling star. No, she came gently, like dew at the edge of dawn. To the world she entered through the dream of a woman. A dream so vivid it burned her womb with moonlight. That dream is lost to time, but its echo still sings. And Ayaba, the child of divine yearning, breathed her first breath beneath a sky heavy with stars, stars that dimmed just slightly, as if bowing. Not a goddess, not yet, only a child, but one born of the spaces between myth and memory, between history and silence, between the lips of Mawu and the heart of the dreaming earth. This is the beginning of her story, a story not etched in stone, but carried in wind, a story not told with trumpets, but whispered beneath the stars. The earth forgets nothing. It only grows quiet. In the far-flung corners of West Africa, where the sun drips gold into cracked earth and time folds itself into the roots of ancient trees, there are places where even the wind walks gently. Places where silence gathers like moss in the mouths of broken statues, where vines swallow stairways and crumbling walls breathe beneath their coats of lichen. Temples forgotten by men, but not by the dust. And if you listen long enough to that dust, if you lie down with your cheek pressed against the earth and your heartbeat slows to match the ancient rhythm pulsing beneath you, you might hear it, her name. Not spoken like a chant, not shouted like the names of conquering kings, but murmured, hummed, as though the stones themselves remember the feel of her footsteps, as though the roots of the baobab trees still echo the songs once sung in her honor. Ayaba. The name was never carved into royal tablets or sung in public procession. No scrolls bear her deeds. No lineage traces its power through her womb. And yet, the earth remembers. It remembers the touch of her bare feet, cool and careful, as she walked the thresholds of sanctuaries now reduced to rubble. Sanctuaries where women once gathered in circles beneath moonlight, where offerings were left not of blood or coin, but of breath, milk, and water, gifts for a goddess not to be appeased, but to be understood. Ayaba was not a deity who demanded. She was a presence, a hush, a mystery wrapped in the scent of damp earth and the rustle of unseen wings. Archaeologists speak of a certain site, half buried beneath centuries of dust and missionary silence, where the remains of a circular temple lie scattered like bone fragments in a dream. Its orientation is strange, not aligned with the sun or cardinal directions, but with the lunar cycle and a particular star whose name has been lost to time. They are among fragments of smooth black clay and symbols etched into stone in looping, lunar curves. A single sigil has appeared again and again, a spiral enclosed within a spiral, almost like a fingerprint made of wind. The local elders, those who still remember the old stories whispered from grandmother to granddaughter, know this symbol. They do not name it aloud, but when they see it, they lower their eyes and place a hand on their chests. Ayaba, they whisper, she who listens beneath the soil. Unlike other deities of fire and conquest, Ayaba's worship was subtle, hidden. She was a goddess of breath and womb, of the spaces between. Her rites were not written, but lived, gestures passed from midwife to daughter, from night to sleep. She belonged to the realm of the intimate, the personal, the internal, the divine feminine that never needed a throne, because she ruled from within. That is why the dust remembers, because it was never through conquest that her presence spread. It was through bodies, through dreams, through whispers carried by women who dared to remember when the world was still whole, when goddesses walked softly and creation hummed like a lullaby. Some say that if you light a fire near one of these old ruins and you remain still, no words, no thoughts, just breath, you may see the ash rise not upward but sideways, as though tracing the path of something unseen, as though something within the dust stirs at your presence, asking softly, do you still remember her? The scholars will tell you it is wind. The priest will say it is blasphemy. But the grandmothers, they will smile and close their eyes, because they know that memory is not kept in books. It is kept in the way we walk through the world. In a quiet reverence, we show to things that do not speak loudly. And in the dust, yes, always in the dust, her name remains. High above the horizon, when the world quiets and the last ember of sunset curls into shadow, she rises. Not with the fire of Ra, nor the storm of Zeus. No, Mawu comes gently, a pale orb cradled in the arms of night. She watches not as a ruler surveys her domain, but as a mother lingers at the doorway of sleeping child. Her light does not demand attention. It invites surrender. In the pantheon of the fawn people of Dahomey, Mawu is the moon mother, creator of humanity, keeper of balance, twin sister of Lisa, the sun. While Lisa blazes and builds, Mawu cools and softens. She brings dreams. She governs sleep, fertility, compassion, and mystery. They say she once wove the world with her bare hands, shaped the sky like cloth, dyed it with midnight, and stitched stars into its hem. With quiet fingers, she molded the earth, breathed life into rivers, curved the hills like a mother curves around her child in slumber. She gave breath not with thunder, but with song. Each note a heartbeat, each pause a moment of rest. But even goddesses, it is said, can feel emptiness. Even Mawu, who made balance her song, could feel the silence of her own design. The myths tell of a time when the moon hung lower in the sky, a time when Mawu would sit in stillness, watching the lives she'd created unfold. Wars ignited, lovers lost, trees felled, temples burned. She did not weep, for weeping is of the flesh. But she longed, a yearning as deep as the void before creation. She longed not for power, but for something softer, a reflection, a companion not born of fire or function, but of essence, of dream. And so, from her breath, long exhaled after creation's first dawn, she dreamed again. Not to make, not to rule, not to command, to dream, to let what was sacred emerge without instruction. This was not creation in the way of gods and laws. This was the flowering of a secret. From that dream came Ayaba, not formed in fire or forged in clay, but curled in the edges of Sai, a being born not of divine will, but divine wonder. Moa never claimed her. No myths inscribed Ayaba as her daughter. No chance placed her name beside Lisa or Legba or the other honored spirits of the Dahamian pantheon. Because Ayaba was not meant to be known, not in the way that names anchor things into the world. She was meant to be felt. And Mawu, ever the quiet weaver of sky and soil, let her go, as mothers do when they know the world needs their child more than they do. Still, on certain nights when the moon is full and silver softens the edges of the world, some say you could see a shimmer around it, a trembling, as though the moon itself is whispering, calling, remembering. Because though Mawu is vast and whole, she too carries the ache of forgotten dreams. And Ayaba was the dream she never dared speak aloud. That is why the moon feels different now than in the old days. Why it glows not only with light, but with something older, something gentler, something watching. They say Mawu never appeared again after Ayaba walked the world. That her voice grew quiet, her breath slow, because she no longer needed to be once her dream had become flesh. So when you look up into the sky and see that glowing pearl afloat in the velvet dark, know this. It is not merely light you see. It is longing. It is memory. It is the eye of a mother who once dreamed the world was missing something and then let it go to find its own way. And every night, she watches still. It begins, as all true stories do, with a dream, but not the kind that flickers briefly in sleep and fades with the dawn. This was a dream heavy with silence, trembling with meaning, a dream that felt like a memory, but from a life never lived. In a small village carved between jungle and river, where the air hums with ancestral voices and the sky curves close to the earth, there lived a woman. Her name has long since vanished from scrolls and stone, but her story endures like smoke trapped in the folds of cloth, soft, elusive, sacred. She was no priestess, no oracle, just a woman of clay and breath, widowed, quiet, invisible to most. She spent her days weaving raffia mats, her nights speaking to the fire as it flickered in her hut. The villagers passed her by with polite nods, never wondering what old grief might linger behind her eyes. But the fire knew, and the moon listened. That night, the stars were bright, and the air was thick with the smell of yams and river salt. She sat alone, as always, sipping from a calabash bowl carved by her father decades before. Its rim was worn smooth by years of stories told to children who now had children of their own. She pressed it to her lips, and as the fermented millet touched her tongue, the world seemed to shift. Time folded in on itself, and the dream began. In the dream, she stood in a vast field of white sand, untouched, endless. Above her, the moon was enormous, low and luminous, casting silver shadows that danced like breath. Her hands, once tired and worn, stretched upward, and the moon descended like a bird drawn to its nest. She held it, not metaphorically, not as symbol, but truly, its light spilling between her fingers, soaking into her skin. It did not burn. It soothed. It pulsed with a heartbeat not her own, a rhythm older than drums, older than the sea. She held it like one holds a child or a secret, and in that moment, she was not herself. She was more. She was vessel, conduit, threshold. Then the voice came. It wasn't a voice as we know it. No language, no sound, just knowing. A warm pressure against her ribs, a stirring in her womb. A single truth whispered not to her ears, but to her bones. You have been chosen to remember what the world has forgotten. She woke before dawn. The fire had died. The calabash had rolled to the floor, still full. But her hands were warm. Not with fever, not with sickness, but with something deeper. She pressed her palms to her belly and felt it there too. A soft glow, like embers hidden beneath skin. At first, she thought she was dying. But death does not come wrapped in moonlight. The women of the village would later whisper that she began to change. Her steps grew quieter, her eyes brighter. She began to speak in half-formed riddles, her voice lilting like birdsong. At the river, she stood unmoving for hours, her gaze fixed on the moon's reflection in the water. When asked what she was doing, she smiled softly and said, "I am listening to my daughter breathe." No one knew what she meant. Some said she had lost her mind. Others said the gods had touched her. But a few, mostly elder women, midwives, widows who had lost children, bowed their heads in silence, because they too had dreamed of the moon once. As the days passed, her belly swelled, not with sickness, not with child in the way the world expects, but with something else. She did not bleed. She did not labor. One morning, she simply walked out to the baobab tree behind her hut, laid down in the earth, and whispered a song the villagers had never heard before. By sunset, the tree was blooming out of season, its blossoms glowing faintly. And she was gone. Not buried. Not taken. Just gone. Her clothes folded neatly beside the roots. The calabash bowl beside them, still warm to the touch. In the hollow of the baobab's trunk, something stirred. A child, yes, but not like others. She did not cry. She did not open her eyes. She simply breathed, deep, slow, steady. The villagers gathered, unsure whether to weep or to worship. And in that strange quiet, an elder stepped forward, eyes glistening, and spoke. She has returned. The dream is walking. The child would grow to be Ayaba, not named for lineage or prophecy, but for presence, for the dream that birthed her, the moon that chose her, and the woman whose body became a gate between worlds. This is not a tale to be proven. There is no record, no inscription. Only the calabash, which still sits in the hollow of that baobab, warm to the touch even now. Only the wind that sings strange lullabies through the roots. And only the dust, which carries her name like pollen, soft, hidden, alive. Because sometimes the divine does not crash into the world with lightning and fire. Sometimes it enters through a dream, and sometimes the moon chooses you. Names are not just sounds. They're spells. In many lands, to name a thing is to summon it, bind it, give it form and fate. But some names rise from silence, not from fathers nor from priests, but from the rhythm of life itself. They emerge like mist over riverbanks at dawn, uninvited, unannounced, inevitable. And so was with her. When the villagers found the child nestled in the warm hollow of the baobab tree, she was not screaming or writhing like newborns do. She lay there still, breathing, the kind of breath that belongs to old trees and distant stars. Her skin shimmered faintly under the moonlight, like the inside of an oyster shell. Her eyes, when she opened them, were silver. She did not blink. She stared, as if seeing the world for the second time. No one dared to claim her. Who could? There was no father to be found. No midwife had caught her. No mother had bled or moaned to bring her forth. And yet there she was, as real as the soil, as strange as the sky. Some wanted to leave her there, call her an omen, let the forest decide her fate. But the women knew better. They gathered around her in a quiet circle. Old women, barren women, women with too many children and not enough food. Women who had lost husbands, hopes, names of their own. They knew the signs, not the signs in books, but the signs written in the bones, in the dreams that visit before storms. They wrapped her in cloth embroidered with faded moons and carried her through the village. They fed her goat's milk, bathed her in herbs, sang songs from memory, songs their grandmothers used to hum when the world was softer. And they named her Ayaba, a name that, in the old tongue, meant queen, but not the kind who wears a crown, not one seated on a throne gilded with jewels. Ayaba meant something deeper, the queen of presence, the one who does not ask for attention, but draws it, the one who carries weight without ever raising her voice, the one whose silence is more commanding than any roar. Ayaba, it was a name breathed rather than spoken, a name sung over cooking fires, whispered during long walks to the river, hummed when rocking children to sleep. She grew without age, or perhaps she aged without growing. It's hard to say. By the time she could walk, her feet moved as though they remembered other lives. She did not stumble. She glided. She would sit for hours under the same baobab where she was found, whispering to the wind, cupping her hands as if holding invisible water. Birds would land near her and not startle. Stray dogs lay beside her, dreaming peacefully. She never asked for anything, and yet everything seemed to come to her. Other children avoided her at first, unsure whether to fear or follow. But over time, they drew near, one by one, as if pulled by an invisible thread. She didn't play with them the way children play. She taught them to sit still, to listen, to close their eyes and hear the drumbeat beneath their own chests. She was not loved by all. The village elders grew uneasy, not the women. They were quiet protectors of her mystery, but the men, the ones who built laws, the ones who carved lineage into bark and traded power like seed. She didn't fit. She didn't belong to any bloodline, any house. She belonged only to the in-between. And in that space, she flourished. One evening, when she was still no taller than a cooking pot, she stood beside the village drum during a moonrite. No one had asked her to be there. No one had taught her the rhythm. But she stepped forward, raised her hands, and began to strike, not with strength but with precision. Boom, boom, pause, boom, boom, pause. The same rhythm used in birthrights. The same rhythm mothers used to coax breath into the lungs of struggling newborns. Everyone froze. Even the wind stopped. They say that for a moment, just a moment, the moon itself shimmered, as if acknowledging its daughter, as if recognizing something not quite divine, not quite mortal, something other. After that night, no one questioned her place again, but they didn't speak of her often either. She became something sacred, and like all sacred things, wrapped in silence. Still, the women remembered. They remembered the fire in her gaze, the calm in her breath, the way she could look into your eyes and unearth things you'd buried long ago. She didn't need books, didn't need temples. She carried her power in her spine, her presence, her stillness. That's what Ayaba meant. Not queen of land, queen of being. And though her name was never written in the annals of kings, nor chanted by robed priests, it passed from lip to lip like a secret song. Ayaba, the dream who walked. Before language, before structure, before history scratched its name into the skin of the world, there was clay, wet, warm, pliable, the womb of the land itself. The elders say Ayaba was not merely born into the world, she was folded into it, as though the land itself had paused, lifted a gentle hand, and tucked her into its quiet heart like a mother tucking a child into a blanket of breath and promise. Her earliest nights were spent not in cradles carved by man, but in the hollows of the earth, nests of leaves and red soil beneath the wide canopy of stars. No walls, no ceiling, just sky and silence, and the hum of distant galaxies watching over her with invisible eyes. It is told that the first time she slept outside the baobab tree, where she was discovered, the wind did not blow. Not a single branch stirred. Even the insects, those eternal singers of the African dusk, fell quiet, as if nature itself wished not to disturb her dreaming. And what dreams they must have been. For this was a child who had not yet learned the boundary between waking and sleeping, between the sacred and the mundane. In her mind, the stars were not faraway things to be named or mapped. They were companions, teachers, echoes of a home she could no longer name, but still felt in her marrow. On the third night of her life, a strange thing happened. A group of women, silent, barefoot, their skirts brushing dust like wind, gathered around a resting place. These were not villagers. They came from the forest, their faces hidden beneath shawls made of moon-colored linen, their hands painted in spirals and symbols older than any known script. No one had summoned them. No one dared question them. Even the village dogs watched from the shadows, ears flat, tails tucked. They formed a circle around the child and began to sing. But not in words. It was a chant of breath and tone, a weaving of sound that seemed to rise from the earth itself. The kind of song that didn't pass through the ears, but moved through the skin into the blood. Their hands moved over the soil, sculpting it slowly into a bowl, a cradle shaped not by desire but by memory. They filled it with damp clay, mixed with ashes from sacred fires long extinguished, and placed the child gently inside. A cradle of clay and stars. Above them, the heavens responded. The stars shimmered not as points of light, but as if they pulsed in rhythm with the chant. One even fell, soft and slow, tracing a silver line across the black tapestry of sky, vanishing behind the hills like a secret delivered. And there she lay, eyes closed, breathing the world in as if to memorize it. It was said that she did not cry for the first 3 years of her life. Not once. She did not need to. Everything she needed came to her: milk, shade, warmth, wonder. Even as an infant, Ayaba was whole. Some believe the clay in which she slept rewrote her bones, that her spine held ironwood, her ribs shaped from the roots of the first tree, her blood rich with mica and ash. Others said she was only human, fragile, warm, temporary, but that her soul was ancient, scattered from the stars and gathered back again by the hand of some forgotten mother. And perhaps both were true, because she grew in rhythm with the earth, not in defiance of it. She did not learn to walk. She remembered it. Her feet did not stomp. They pressed the ground like prayers. She did not speak until she was 5. But on the day she did, she walked barefoot to the riverbank, crouched by the water, and whispered 3 words to a sleeping fish. The fish blinked, rose to the surface, and stared at her as though it had been waiting its whole life to hear what she said. What those words were, no one knows. But the fish did not swim away. It stayed, floating beside her as she dipped her fingers into the river, humming softly, as if finishing a lullaby the stars had started the day she was born. It is said that when she began to speak to others, her words felt like wind through tall grass, gentle, persistent, full of motion. She would not speak to everyone, only to those who asked not with mouths, but with silence. She spoke most to the elders, to the midwives, to the widows who still cried in the night when no one could hear. She asked them questions that sounded like riddles, but were not. Do you remember the shape of your mother's breath? What did the sky taste like when you were a child? Do your bones still remember when they were stars? And they would weep, not from sorrow, from recognition, because somehow she pulled things from deep inside them. Memories long buried, long denied, not of events, but of essence, as if she could speak to the part of you that was born before you name. It was then that the women began to call her not only Ayaba, but also daughter of clay and sky, a name not meant for governance, but for remembrance, for she reminded them of something they had long forgotten, that the divine is not always loud, that gods do not always arrive in chariots, that sometimes the most sacred beings sleep in clay cradles beneath a sky full of lullabies. And though her name was never etched into stone, she was etched into the earth, into every quiet breath, every forgotten lullaby, every cradle still shaped by hand, because the world may forget names, but it never forgets presence. And Ayaba, wrapped in the dust of the first fire and the light of the oldest stars, was presence incarnate. There are moments in every myth when the sacred collides with fear, not the fear of monsters or omens, but the subtler fear of what cannot be named. By the time Ayaba could speak in full sentences, people had begun to whisper about her. They spoke in the breath between words, in the space between chores and market bartering. They didn't say her name loudly. They didn't look her in the eyes for too long, but everyone felt it. She was not like them, not because she was proud. She wasn't. She bowed to elders. She fetched water with the other children. She helped bury the dead. But there was something in her gaze, a stillness that made even the most devout men pause, as though they were being seen through, not just seen. And so, the priests were summoned. The village council, mostly men, many of whom wore animal skins dyed with ash and ochre, decided that it was time. Time to read her fate. Time to define her, contain her. They called it tradition. But behind their painted masks and polished staffs, their fingers trembled. Still, they prepared the sacred circle. They laid down the woven mats embroidered with protective symbols, swept the earth clean with palm branches, lit the oils that sent blue smoke curling into the sky like prayers trying to find their way home. And they brought the cowrie shells, shells that had been passed from oracle to oracle for generations, smoothed by countless readings, countless fates, now worn soft as whispers. They believed they could read anyone. Kings, warriors, thieves, even spirits posing as men. But Ayaba was none of these. She entered the circle barefoot. She did not ask why. She did not resist. She stood in the center as though it were not foreign to her, as though she had been there before, in another life, another world. The oldest priest, a man with hair like river mist and a voice that once made birds stop singing, raised the gourd and shook it. The shells rattled inside. Life, death, marriage, drought, war, rebirth, all contained in their tiny bone-like bodies. He cast them, and they fell. Asterisk, asterisk. Wrong asterisk, asterisk. Not reversed. Not cursed. Just blank. They landed flat, upright, sideways. They did not speak. The priest stared, murmured, tried again, once, twice, 3 times. But the shells made no sound, no meaning, no sign. It was as if they had forgotten how to speak. One priest whispered, "Perhaps the gods are testing us." Another said, "Perhaps she is possessed." But the eldest said nothing. He only looked at Ayaba, his lips dry, his breath shallow. And Ayaba smiled, not in mockery, not in defiance. It was the kind of smile that comes from knowing something others have forgotten. A sadness veiled in gentleness. A kindness so ancient it frightened him. Then the wind came. It rushed through the circle, sharp and sudden, and scattered the cowries across the dirt like seeds. One struck the priest's wrist. Another rolled into the fire. A third fell at Ayaba's feet. She bent, picked it up, and turned it in her palm, slowly. It had cracked, a perfect hairline fracture running through its center like lightning caught in bone. She placed it back on the mat with care, as if returning something borrowed from a world not meant to be touched. The priest said nothing more. They dismissed her with the excuse that the spirits were unclear, that perhaps the season was wrong, or that the river gods were restless. But inside they knew. They hadn't failed to read her. She had refused to be read. She was not in the shells, not in the bones, not in the lineage of gods they knew how to name. She was before those things. And so they called for silence. No more questions. No more rituals. Let her be, they said. Let her grow like a wild tree. Tall, silent, strange. But the women knew better. They understood what the silence meant. It was not absence. It was protection. Some things are not meant to be interpreted. They are meant to be witnessed. So they stopped asking the cowries. And instead, they listened to the way the birds followed her. The way rain fell when she danced barefoot on cracked ground. The way children leaned into her shoulder as if they'd always known her. She became mystery, not the kind you solve, the kind you sit beside in the dark and feel honored to touch. And in this, her true power began to bloom. She cannot be named. She cannot be read. She cannot be placed in any story but her own. Even the oracles, who had always spoken for the gods, fell quiet before her, because deep down they understood what their silence truly meant. They were not in the presence of prophecy. They were in the presence of origin. The river knows things. It remembers every footstep that is pressed against its muddy banks, every whisper carried across its surface, every offering tossed in with trembling hands. It remembers the births it cooled, the sorrows it carried, the songs it swallowed. The river holds memory in motion, and that is where Ayaba loved to be most. At dusk, when the heat began to loosen its grip and the trees cast long shadows like ancient fingers reaching across the land, she would leave the village and walk alone, barefoot, always barefoot, toward the bend in the river where the water moved slow and deep. She would sit for hours without moving, not in boredom, not in loneliness, but in listening to what no one truly knew. Some thought she was praying. Others whispered that she spoke to ancestors. But the children, with their open hearts and untamed eyes, knew the truth. She was speaking to fireflies. They would appear just after twilight, when the sky turned the color of smoke and mango skin. Dozens of them, hundreds, a flickering constellation not above but around her, swirling, pulsing, hovering near her skin as if they knew her. And she would speak, not with words, not with gestures, just breath, a subtle rhythm in the stillness of her chest, like the beat of a drum heard through layers of silk. And in return, the fireflies would answer. Their flickers weren't random. They pulsed in patterns, pauses, pulses, like code, like music, a language made of light and silence. They would dance around her in gentle spirals, land on her shoulders, rest on her open palms. Sometimes they would cover her like a shawl of living stars, their glow breathing in time with hers. And in those moments, it was as if the line between Ayaba and the world around her disappeared. She was the fireflies. She was the night. The villagers watched from a distance, not out of fear, but out of reverence, because there was something sacred in the way she sat there, unmoving, untouched by the insects that pestered everyone else, her skin luminous under their golden glow. It felt as though she was holding conversation with the spirit of the earth itself. And perhaps she was. Some said the fireflies were messengers. Others said they were fragments of ancestors drawn to her light. But one old woman, a widow who had lost 4 sons and never spoke unless the wind moved first, whispered something different. They come because she remembers what they were before they had wings. When a moon was full, Ayaba would hum, just softly, a vibration in her throat, so low it was more felt than heard. And the fireflies would respond all at once, bursting into a synchronized glow, illuminating the trees, the water, the very air, as if the stars had spilled from the sky to listen. Even the river would seem to hush. No ripples, no frog song, just the gentle breathing of night, holding itself still in awe. One evening, a boy from the village crept closer than usual. He had always been curious about Ayaba, always watched her with a hunger of one searching for something he could not name. He stepped on a branch. It cracked, loud as thunder, and suddenly, just for a moment, the fireflies went dark. All of them. He froze, heart pounding. Ayaba turned her head toward him slowly. Not in anger, not even in surprise. Just acknowledgement. And then she did something no one expected. She opened her hand, extended it toward him, and spoke a single word. Sit. The boy obeyed. He sat beside her, knees in the dirt, hands clenched tight with nerves. She said nothing more, only placed her hand gently on the earth between them. And within minutes, the fireflies returned. One landed on his nose, another on his wrist. He laughed without meaning to. She looked at him and said, with a smile like dusk itself, "They only speak when we stop trying to talk over them." That was the lesson. Not to control, not to command, but to remember how to be quiet enough to hear the world speak back. After that night, more children came to sit with her. Not many, only those who knew how to be still. She never turned them away, but she never invited them either. It was not something to be taught. It was something to be shared like light. And the fireflies always knew. They would come only when Ayaba was near, and only when silence was made sacred. Some say that when Ayaba finally disappeared, years later, as quietly as she had arrived, the fireflies vanished with her, that they no longer gather by the river in such numbers, that their flickers are fewer now, like dying echoes. But others say that if you go to that bend in the river on the first night of the new moon, and you sit, truly sit, without speaking, without asking, without needing, she will come, not in form, not in shadow, but in flickers. And if you're very quiet, you might hear her breath in the glow, or feel her gaze in the rhythm of wings, or remember, just briefly, what it was like when the world was still speaking to you in the language of light. There are memories that do not belong to us. We carry them still, in the ache behind our ribs when a certain song plays. In a way we flinch at shadows we've never seen, in dreams that leave us breathless, as if we've returned from a place older than time itself. Ayaba began to remember things no child should know. She was still small, her legs thin as reed stalks, her hands soft with the clay of riverbanks. But at night, when the fire dimmed and the stars slipped behind clouds, she would wake with tears on her cheeks, her breath trembling, her eyes wide as if she'd seen something too vast to describe. She couldn't explain it at first. No words could hold what she carried. She would sit outside her hut, curled under a blanket woven by the village women, and stare into the darkness. Not afraid, but searching. When asked what she had seen, she would whisper, a city made of breath, a tower carved from moonlight, and a woman screaming without sound. The elders exchanged glances. The midwives sat beside her and did not ask again. But the widows, those who had learned to live with echoes, understood. Because what Ayaba was remembering didn't come from this life. It came from somewhere else. Somewhere that had no name anymore. Somewhere that had once been sacred and broken. She began to draw, in the sand with sticks, on clay pots with river ink, circles within circles, spirals, lines that intersected like threads of energy caught in the web of fate. One drawing showed a woman with wings, not angelic but elemental. Her wings were made of smoke and stone, her eyes filled with stars. Around her were children curled in baskets woven from roots. Above her, a sky cracked open, not with lightning, but with memory. She never said who the woman was, but when she finished the drawing, she looked up and whispered. She was forgotten, but she didn't forget us. It was then the villagers began to realize Ayaba wasn't just seeing visions. She was remembering, memories that pulsed not from her mind, but from her bones. The old women called it blood echo, a rare gift, dangerous and divine. The belief that certain souls are born carrying fragments of other lives. Not just ancestors, but beings, spirits, goddesses, those who had once shaped the world and were then exiled to silence. Ayaba was one such vessel, and the memories came unbidden. Sometimes during storms, when thunder split the sky and the wind howled like wolves at the edges of the forest. Sometimes in absolute calm, when no bird sang, no tree stirred, and the air hung heavy with secrets. She spoke of battles not recorded, of temples buried under salt, of women carved into mountains, faces turned skyward, mouths open in permanent song. And always she remembered the lullaby, a melody so soft it could barely be heard, a tune that made her body sway without realizing, a song that rose from her chest like mist. She didn't know the words, none remained, but the feeling was unmistakable. Loss, love, light being pulled from skin. The village children began to gather near her when she hummed. They would sit cross-legged in the dirt, their eyes wide, their mouths open slightly, as if trying to catch the last notes of a dream. One child, barely 5, looked up at her once and asked, "Did you die before you were born?" Ayaba smiled sadly, touched his cheek, and said only, "Maybe I just came back too soon." The elders grew wary. They did not like what she remembered. It disrupted the stories they had passed down, the clean lines of myth and ritual. Her memories blurred those lines. They brought back forgotten gods, unwritten wars, sacred knowledge that had been buried for a reason. So they called her visions illness. They tried to ground her in daily tasks, sweeping, cooking, tending the goats. But no matter how they tried, the past found her, in dreams, in songs, in stones that pulsed beneath her hands. She once touched a carved rock on the river's edge and fell silent for 3 days. When she spoke again, her voice was different, lower, ancient, echoing as though many spoke through one mouth. She said, "They buried her under the sea, not to protect her, but to forget her. But the water remembers." No one asked who she was. No one needed to, because when Ayaba closed her eyes and whispered, the world listened, even the wind. And some nights, when the moon was thin and the sky trembled with unseen motion, the fireflies would gather not around her, but above her, forming a circle, a ring of light, like a crown not made of gold, but of memory. Because Ayaba did not just walk through the world, she walked through what had been. And with each step, she brought the forgotten closer to the surface, like bones rising through the soil, like gods waking from dream. Some say the moon does not shine, that she only borrows light from the sun, a reflection, not a fire. But those who have truly watched the moon, not with the eyes, but with the soul, know this is not true. There are nights when the moon remembers herself, when she glows not from borrowed brilliance, but from the memory of being whole. And one such night came for Mawu. It was long after Ayaba had begun to speak to fireflies, after the cowrie shells had fallen silent, after the dreams returned with their burden of forgotten worlds. The village was asleep. Even the dogs did not stir. Only Ayaba sat awake, as she often did, wrapped in a shawl woven from old cloth and moon dust, her feet bare against the cool earth, her eyes turned skyward. That night, the moon rose full and heavy, so close it seemed you could reach up and press your palm to it. And in the stillness, as if the sky itself leaned in to listen, the moon paused. It did not climb higher. It did not pass. It watched. It looked upon the girl who should not have been, the one not born from womb or prophecy, but from dream, the one carried in clay and humming with ancient light. And for the first time in 1,000 years, Mawu saw her reflection, but it was not the woman she remembered. Gone was the celestial grandeur, the veil of divinity, the weight of cosmic responsibility. In Ayaba, she saw herself before she became the moon, before she carved the world, before she was worshipped and forgotten and remembered again. She saw the essence of herself, curious, wild, radiant, a self not tasked with balance, but born of joy, and she wept, not tears as we know them, not drops that fall and vanish, but silver. The moonlight itself seemed to ripple, to soften, to shimmer with sorrow and awe. Some say that Ayaba looked up in that moment and smiled, and in her smile, Mawu saw not just a reflection, but a daughter, not of blood, not of bone, but a being, a manifestation of what Mawu had once longed to become again. For Mawu, goddess of the moon, bearer of the night, was wise, balanced, enduring, but she had grown distant, silent, carved into ritual and statute. Ayaba was none of those things. She was breath, movement, freedom, and in that freedom, Mawu remembered herself. Some of the old women say that on that night, the moon leaned just a little closer, that for one brief heartbeat, it was not Ayaba who looked up to the heavens, but Mawu who looked down and whispered, "You are what I could never be," not out of regret, not out of envy, but with the grace of a mother, releasing her child into the world, knowing that the child will walk where she cannot follow. Others say Ayaba never spoke of that night, that she simply returned to her hut, lit a small oil lamp, and sat in silence. But from that day forward, something changed. Her presence deepened. She walked with the weight of starlight. Children who had once watched her with awe now reached for her hands, as if drawn by something older than affection, as if recognizing her as a tether to a truth they'd always known, but had no words for. And the moon? The moon was never quite the same. It still rose. It still lit the night. But sometimes, in the space between full and empty, in a hush between owl cry and dawn breeze, it would flicker, just for a moment, as if remembering, as if blinking back a tear made of silver, not for what had been lost, but for what had finally returned. Because gods do not often see themselves. They are too high, too still, too adorned. But that night, Mawu saw her mirror, and in Ayaba, she remembered what it meant to dream. There are places on the earth where the air does not belong to the present, where even the birds do not sing, where roots coil like serpents around broken stone, and time itself seems to pause, as if waiting for permission to breathe again. One such place lies hidden in the cradle of the forest, beyond the old footpaths, past the trees that lean like ancient sentinels. The locals do not mark it on maps. It is not spoken of in daylight, only in whispers, only by women, only in the dark. They call it the Temple of All Wombs. Not because it was built by wombs, though it was. Not because it honored them, though it did. But because it held them, held the memory of every birth, every moan, every bleeding that once shaped the world. A temple not of gold, not of marble, but of mud, salt, and blood, of soft prayers and feral power. It is said no man has ever crossed its threshold and returned unchanged. Not by punishment, not by curse, but by forgetting. The temple does not destroy men. It erases them, because what is housed there cannot be grasped through conquest, only surrendered to. And surrender has never been a language carved into the bones of kings. Long ago, long before Ayaba took her first breath beneath the baobab, this temple had a name. It is lost now, as most sacred things are, but some fragments remain, etched into broken tiles, painted on stones buried beneath moss, sung in the last syllables of lullabies. What little survives speaks of a circle. No walls, no doors, only an opening carved into the forest, shaped like the curve of a pregnant belly, roofed in living vines and shadow. At its center, a pool. Shallow, dark still. Water that reflects not your face, but your origin, the moment before you became. Women once gathered there, not to worship, but to remember, to bleed together, to bury the names they were given, and speak the ones they carried in secret. Some came to birth, others to bury. All came to become. It was in this place, veiled from the eyes of time, that Ayaba was once seen. The story is not written. It exists only in the mouths of 3 women, all over 100 years old, who have never met, but tell the same tale. They say she walked into the jungle barefoot, as always, wearing a skirt made of river grass and a shawl spun from cloud gray cotton. She carried nothing, spoke to no one. She simply walked, and the forest opened. Trees bent slightly, as if bowing. Leaves parted in silence. Even the insects ceased their buzzing. It was dusk when she arrived at the temple. The last light of the sun slipped through the canopy, in thin, trembling strands, like threads being sewn into a new skin. And there, in the center of the ancient circle, Ayaba stood, not as a goddess, not as a girl, but as something between. She did not chant. She did not kneel. She did not burn anything. She danced, not with rhythm, not with pattern, but with presence. She let her body move as if pulled by tides beneath the earth. Her arms curved like roots seeking water. Her feet kissed the soil like memory returning to bone. Each movement was a breath. Each pause was a prayer. The water in the center rippled, not from her steps, but from something rising beneath it. Not seen, only sensed. The women who watched from the tree line, hidden in the dark, say that the moon lit her skin from within, that she glowed like the inside of a seed just before it bursts, that the vines above her blossomed out of season, and that for a moment they heard it, a heartbeat, not hers, not the earth's, but the heartbeat of the first womb, the one that gave birth to gods, to dust, to everything. When Ayaba finished dancing, she stood still. Her chest rose and fell. Her eyes closed, and from her lips came a single word, not in any known language, not in any human tongue, but in the original sound, the sound of becoming. It shook the air without noise. It moved through the skin like water moves through thirst, and it has never been heard again. The next morning, she returned to the village, barefoot, silent, changed, not visibly, not in form, but in gravity. People stepped aside when she passed, not out of fear, but out of reverence. They didn't know where she had gone, but they knew something ancient had remembered her name. And the temple? It sank deeper into the forest, wrapped in vines, guarded by silence. Now only women of certain bloodlines know how to find it, and even fewer dare, because the Temple of All Wounds is not a place you visit. It is a place that calls you. And once you are called, you will never truly belong to the world again. You will always carry something inside. A flicker, a hum, a pulse. Reminding you that once, long ago, you were part of the beginning. And so was she. Ayaba, the girl who danced where only mothers once bled. The woman who spoke without sound. The dream who reminded the womb of its own divinity. There's a kind of power that does not raise its voice. It does not seek to be crowned. It does not demand altars or carve commandments in a stone. It simply is. And that was Ayaba. She never once called herself goddess. She did not cloak herself in the language of priests, nor speak with the cadence of those who wish to be followed. She did not name herself, because she had never been unnamed. To be named is to be limited, to be given shape, boundary, history. Ayaba was born beyond such things, or perhaps before them. And because she refused a title, the world whispered many. They called her spirit, mother, ancestral echo, living myth, divine child, witch, but none of these words ever fit. Not quite. The elders who remembered the old gods watched her with the caution given to storms that do not rumble, the kind that slip in through the trees, quiet as fog, and leave behind rivers where none existed before. She was, in every sense, elemental. The rain changed when she stood beneath it, not in volume, but in intent. It seemed to pause mid-fall, hesitating between sky and earth, as if unsure whether it was blessing her or being blessed by her. When she walked through the forest, the birds grew quiet, not from fear, but from listening. Even the trees leaned ever so slightly toward her path, not bowed, not bent, but attentive, as though they remembered her footsteps from another life. When she had walked not upon the soil, but within it, there is a story shared by an old blind woman whose voice trembles like reeds in wind, about the day a prince came to see Ayaba. He had heard rumors, as princes do, of a girl with silver eyes who did not age, of a child who had danced with light, of a woman who could make even the fireflies bow. He arrived with drums, with gold, with spears carried by men who looked only forward, and she met him at the edge of the village, under the shadow of a palm tree whose fronds had turned white from age. She said nothing. She simply stood barefoot in the dust, wrapped in a shawl that smelled of river mint and old rain. The prince dismounted, confident. He spoke of alliances, of power, of names. He asked her, "What are you?" She tilted her head gently and replied, "What are you when you are not pretending?" The prince laughed at first, but then he didn't. He returned to his horse. He said nothing. He rode away and never returned. Some say he went mad. Others say he went to the mountains to find his true name. But those who know Ayaba understood. She was not meant to be possessed, not meant to be labeled. She was not a goddess to be worshipped. She was a presence to be remembered. The children understood her best, not because they grasped her mystery, but because they didn't need to. They would sit beside her without speaking, sometimes playing with twigs or drawing circles in the dust. And she would hum, little tones, soft as breath, shaped not by melody, but by meaning, the kind of sound that reminded you how it felt to be held, before you had a name, before the world taught you to strive. Some nights, she would walk alone to the riverbank, kneel beside the water, and trace patterns on the surface with her fingers. The water would glow faintly, just around her hand, and if you watched closely, you'd swear the ripples formed symbols, words in a forgotten tongue. She never explained what they meant, because they weren't meant for us. They were meant for the world itself, for the sky, for the roots, for the wind, for Mawu perhaps, Because though Ayaba never claimed divinity, the divine recognized her. And that's what mattered. That's what makes her story different from all the others. From the gods who sought worship, from the kings who carved names into mountains. Ayaba needed none of that. Her power did not rise from fear, nor from ritual, nor from blood spilled in her name. Her power rose from being. She existed, fully, without permission, without apology, in the world, wise enough to know when it was in the presence of something holy, bowed not in obedience, but in gratitude. Even now, long after her footprints have faded, long after her shawl has returned to dust, her essence lingers, not in temples, not in scripture, but in stillness, in every moment you choose to listen, to remember, to breathe without reaching, to exist without naming. Because the goddess who wore no name never truly left. She lives in the unnamed spaces between your thoughts, in the echo before the word, in the silence that holds you, when you forget who you are and become who you've always been. In the heart of many cultures, old and sprawling as root systems beneath forgotten kingdoms, masks have always held power. They're not costumes. They're thresholds. A mask is a door between the seen and the unseen. It allows the mortal to borrow the face of the divine, the shaman to wear the shadow of the ancestor, the priestess to channel the thunder of gods without shattering her body in the process. To wear a mask was never mere tradition. It was a transaction. You gave something of yourself to gain something from the beyond. And so, when Ayaba's presence began to ripple beyond the village, when the elders from nearby lands sent emissaries to observe her, to witness her walking barefoot in the still heat of dusk, speaking to fireflies, whispering to the river, dreaming in the language of origin, they did what sacred orders have always done with what they do not understand. They tried to define her, not with questions, but with offerings. They arrived with carved masks, heavy with meaning, painted in pigments ground from river stones and ash, anointed with oils steeped in prayers. Each mask was exquisite, and each carried a title older than memory. Mother of seeds, watcher of shadows, daughter of wind, midwife of silence, guardian of the blood gate, one who walks between. They laid them before her, stacked gently upon woven mats of banana leaf and raffia, bowing low, whispering, "Choose the face you wish to wear." But Ayaba did not move. She did not even lower her eyes. Instead, she sat quietly beside the masks, her knees drawn up, her fingers tracing the dirt in a slow, winding spiral. The emissaries waited, for hours, then for a night, then for two. They fasted. They chanted. One old priest wept. Another grew angry. But Ayaba remained unmoved. On the third morning, as the dew still clung to the fronds, and the first birds began to test their voices against the light, she finally looked up. She rose slowly, not with pomp, but with gravity, with stillness so deep it bent the air around her. She walked to the nearest mask, a dark mahogany piece carved with the face of Asen, the spirit of the afterbirth, the one who guards the veil between worlds. She touched it, only once, then whispered, "This was not meant for me." She moved to the next, a mask etched with the symbol of the moon goddess herself, Mawu. She held it in her palms, studied it with the gentleness of memory, then shook her head. "This, too, is someone else's echo." She continued, one by one, each mask honored, each declined, and finally, she stood before them all, her face illuminated by the soft blue light that only comes before dawn, and said, "I was not born to wear the faces of others. I came to remind you of your own." The priests were silent, not in shame, but in awe, because in that moment, they saw what they had refused to see, that Ayaba was not an empty vessel to be filled with old titles. She was not a mirror to reflect forgotten gods. She was something else. She was the face behind a mask, the part that had always been there, quiet, waiting, beneath the painted wood, beneath the chants, beneath the mythologies layered like veils over truth. Ayaba did not reject the masks out of arrogance. She did not insult the spirits. In fact, she honored them more deeply than anyone had in generations, by refusing to hide behind them. Because what she carried, that soft, luminous thing humming just beneath her skin, could not be shaped by story. It could only be lived. In the days that followed, children stopped wearing masks during the harvest dances. They painted their own faces instead, not to imitate, but to become. Young girls stopped asking what goddess they should pray to, and instead asked, "What do I remember when I close my eyes?" Even the priests changed. Some kept their rituals. Others laid their masks down and began to dream again, because Ayaba did not destroy tradition. She opened it, like a seed cracked open not by fire, but by rain. She reminded them that the divine is not always something worn, or summoned, or feared. Sometimes, it is simply a girl who chooses to remain barefaced, beneath the eyes of those who cannot understand her, and still offers them silence instead of shame. Because in her silence, they saw their own need to name, to shape, to grasp, and in her refusal, they found permission to let go. The goddess who wore no name also wore no mask. She was light without lens, sound without echo, presence without costume, and in doing so, she became the most sacred thing of all, a truth too whole to be divided, a face that needed nothing but itself. In every village across the region, there are nights that belong to rhythm, nights when the earth itself seems to awaken beneath pounding heels, when flames twist to the pulse of carved drums, and voices rise not with melody, but with the old, wordless power of breath and bone. The solstice was one such night, a sacred time, a bridge between the cycles, a closing of one breath and the inhalation of the next. Drummers came from far beyond the forests, old men with hands like tree bark, young boys whose fingers flew like birds, women wrapped in fabric dyed with crushed indigo, their ankles beaded with seeds that rattled with every step. The air was thick with the scent of palm oil, with sweat, smoke, anticipation. Children wove through legs like ghosts, eyes wide, mouths already humming the beat. The drums began at dusk, a soft call at first, one drum, then two, then five, then the whole circle, rising like a storm building over the sea. People danced. They danced as their ancestors had danced, feet pounding the dust until it rose around them in clouds, spines bending like stalks of millet, hands slicing through air thick with spirit. And at the center of it all, the fire, wide, wild, reaching, a mouth of flame fed by centuries of tradition. But then, as the moon climbed higher and the fire roared louder, she appeared, Ayaba, barefoot, wrapped in silence. She did not enter the circle. She walked along its edge, the way the moon skirts the world without ever fully belonging to it. No one called to her. No one dared. The drummers watched her from the corners of their eyes, fingers never missing a beat, but slowing, just slightly. It was said that Ayaba never danced at village ceremonies, not out of disdain, but out of something more complex, an intimacy too deep to be shared in spectacle. But that night, something shifted. She stepped into the circle, and the drums stopped, not from command, not from fear. They stopped as if the air had thickened, as if their hands forgot how to move. The silence was immediate, complete, heavy like water. Even the fire dimmed, not died, but lowered itself, As if it too wished to listen, Ayaba stood alone in the center. She did not speak. She did not lift her hands. She did not dance. She only breathed, and her breath was enough, because it carried with it something unspoken, a grief that was not hers alone, a remembrance older than the music, older than the beat, older than the skin stretched across the drums themselves. Some say they saw visions in that moment. A woman kneeling in salt water, her palms open to the sky, a cradle of stars falling into a forest, a procession of women walking backward through time. No one knows how long the silence lasted. Time seemed to vanish. The night folded inward. Even the trees bent closer. And then Ayaba did something simple. She placed one hand on her chest, closed her eyes, and whispered, "This is what the world sounded like before you were born." No louder than the rustle of leaves. But it moved through them all. A vibration, a memory, a reckoning. When the drums resumed, slowly, hesitantly, they played a different rhythm. No longer the rhythm of celebration, of ritual, of repetition, but of return. A slower beat, a deeper one that made people weep as they danced. Not for sorrow, but for relief, because Ayaba had reminded them of something buried, that the drum is not only for the feet, it is for the heart, and sometimes the heart needs silence, to remember how to beat. That night, no one spoke her name, no one bowed, no one praised. They simply followed, not with words, but with breath, because once Ayaba had stood still in the center of the fire circle, everything else had to learn how to move differently. Even the sky, even the drums, even time. Every deity leaves behind something. A footprint in stone, a tower that touches the sky, a golden statue frozen mid-blessing, altars blackened by incense, scrolls that speak their name in languages dead and sacred. But Ayaba left none of these. No shrines were raised in her image. No relics sealed in glass. No hymns penned in ink and handed down through the mouths of priests. She never asked for worship. She never permitted it. The people who tried, those who came with polished stones and scented oils, eager to carve her likeness in wood, were met not with scorn, but with silence. A silence that reached deep inside them. That asked without words, "Why must you look outside to find what was always within?" So they stopped. The sculptors returned to their homes. The would-be priests untied their ceremonial belts. And those who had once sought to build temples in her name sat, instead, by the riverside, with open hands and wet eyes and no answers, because Ayaba did not need walls to be remembered. She lived in spaces temples could never hold, in the pause between inhale and exhale, in the last second before sleep when the world softens, in the hush that follows grief, in the stillness after a child is born and the mother weeps, alone, in relief and wonder. That is where she remained, a goddess with no altars, because her altar was the human heart. The villagers spoke of this in different ways. The children said she lived in their dreams. The women said she lingered in the smoke above their cooking fires. The old said she had returned to the clay that birthed her, and could now be felt when the rains came without wind. There were signs, of course, small ones, a palm leaf shaped like a spiral, a breeze that carried the scent of river water on a dry day, a newborn who opened her eyes and did not cry, but never monuments. The truth is, there was no single place to find her, because she was in all places. And those who truly knew her never tried to trap her with stone or ceremony. They simply remembered. They carried her like a hum at the base of the spine, like a drumbeat just beneath the rib cage, like a shadow that moved with them in the sun. One midwife, now long buried beneath a silk cotton tree, once said, "I never built her an altar. I gave her my body instead." Each time I caught a child, I whispered her name. Not aloud, just beneath my tongue. And I could feel her, in the breath between the baby's first cry and the mother's last push. That was her temple. Not pillars, but people. Not relics, but memory. Some scholars, those who search for gods with scalpels and measuring tapes, have declared Ayaba a mythical absence, a story too vague, a legend with no location. They flipped through pages frustrated, asking, "Where is the proof?" And the answer is always, here, not in your books, but in your longing, because Ayaba was never meant to be found in ruins. She was never meant to be reconstructed from shards of pottery or deciphered from faded glyphs. She was meant to be felt in the moment when your voice breaks, when your hands shake with both fear and love, when your soul remembers something the mind has forgotten. That is when she appears, not with a face, not with a name, but with a presence so tender, so vast, so quiet, that the world seems to breathe differently for a moment. And then, just like that, she's gone, not vanished, just returned to where she came from, the breath, the clay, the dream before the beginning. Because the goddess with no altars was never asking to be praised. She was asking to be known. And knowing her means letting go of the need to build anything in her image, because you have already been built in hers. The wind changed before the ships arrived. The elders felt it first. A tension in the soil, a silence that no longer comforted but warned. Birdsong fell out of rhythm. The baobab trees, ancient and unshaken for centuries, began to drop leaves before their season. And the river, once so familiar, seemed to hesitate at its own bend, as though it sensed something unnatural crossing its path. Then the smoke came. Thick, foreign, uninterested in permission. Men stepped onto the land with boots too heavy, eyes that did not blink at beauty, and hands eager to erase. They came with books that named only one god, with maps that carved invisible lines through living forests, with iron rails that cut across sacred paths like scars, with flags stitched by hands that had never touched clay. They did not come seeking Ayaba. They did not even know her story, but they could feel her. She was in the way the women stood tall beside their cooking fires, unafraid. She was in the circles drawn quietly in the dirt, in the lullabies that refused to be translated. She was in the rhythm of birth that could not be controlled, in the soft rebellion of mothers who smiled but would not kneel. And so, they feared her, even without knowing her name, because what cannot be named cannot be conquered, and what cannot be conquered must be destroyed. They began with the temples, those that still stood, those that remembered, even the ones that were only whispered about, veiled by vines and time. They burned the altars they could find, mocked the chants they could not pronounce, tore down totems, buried drums, banned gatherings that circled fire instead of pew. They rewrote stories, spoke of savagery where once there had been cosmology, labeled sacred knowledge as superstition, declared the old ways primitive, not because they understood them, but because they did not control them. And still, Ayaba remained. They could not find her. How could they? She lived in the breath, in the hush between contractions, in the soil beneath the mango trees they never noticed, in the women who no longer spoke her name aloud, but carried her in their marrow. So the colonizers turned their eyes to the women. They outlawed the midwives, replaced them with clinics and steel, declared the moon rights indecent, labeled the river songs obscene. They forced names onto the children, names from saints they'd never meet, in tongues they did not dream in. But Ayaba does not vanish when forced underground. She becomes ash, and ash is sacred because it remembers fire. The women adapted. They hid their rituals in plain sight. The old chants became work songs. The sacred symbols were stitched into hymns. The river offerings were disguised as laundry, and the memory of Ayaba was passed not through books, but through touch. A hand on the belly during birth, a whisper at the ear of the dying, a glance exchanged during prayer, just before bowing to a god they were told to love, but did not feel in their bones. Ayaba smoldered, silent, waiting. The colonizers built railroads over sacred footpaths, but they could not hear the soil beneath the tracks humming her name. They paved roads through forests, but never noticed the trees that leaned back, just slightly, as if shielding something behind them. And when they finally left, tired, confused, bloated with gold and shame, they left behind ruins they thought were empty. But they were not empty, because every stone they scorched still carried the echo of her breath. Every hut they deemed humble still sheltered her lullaby. Every girl they renamed still dreamed in spirals. Ayaba was never meant to rule. She was meant to remain, and remain she did, not as a statue, not as scripture, but as the sacred ash beneath the colonial smoke, soft scattered, quietly waiting for the wind to rise again. The old women say the river is not a place. It is a memory, flowing, a dream too wide to hold in the body. So the earth shaped a path for it, and named it water. But some rivers are more than water. Some are witnesses, and the river that carries Ayaba has been watching for a very long time. It winds through lowlands and shadows, moving gently, as if reluctant to disturb what sleeps in its belly. Its banks are soft, overgrown, fragrant with the breath of wild herbs. Birds do not sing above it. They listen. Children do not splash in it. They wait, because this is not a river for noise. This is a river for remembrance. They say it flows only at night, that by day it lies still shallow, whispering to the reeds. But when the sun sets, and the first bats trace their fragile wings across the sky, the current returns. Slow, silver, sure. No one knows where it begins. No one knows where it ends. But everyone knows where it calls. There is a clearing not marked on any map, just past the thickest trees where even the wind seems to hold its breath. And in this clearing, at the river's edge, is a circle of stones, half buried in moss, soft with the wear of generations. It is here that the women gather, not loudly, not regularly, not because they are told, but because something inside them pulls. Some come with babies on their backs. Some come with wounds still bleeding beneath cloth. Some come with stories they have never spoken aloud. They do not bring candles. They do not build fires. They bring only themselves and their silence. And Ayaba meets them there, not with a face, not with a voice, but in the way the river moves. It does not rush. It cradles. It curves around their ankles like a mother's hand. It washes away not dirt, but forgetting, because each of these women has carried a weight that does not have a name. The weight of being seen and not understood, of being touched and not felt, of being told who they are, while something deeper inside waits, untouched. And the river knows, because it carries Ayaba. It carries the parts of her that were never buried, never burned, never erased, only scattered. It carries her breath, her hum, her memory. Some nights, if the moon is full, and the sky is clear, and no one speaks, the water glows, not like fire, not like phosphorescence, but like a heartbeat pulsing through the current. Women step into the river then, one by one. No rituals, no lines. They just walk until the water kisses their thighs, their hips, their wombs, and they stand, eyes closed, breathing. Some cry, some sing, some only listen, to the water, to themselves, to Ayaba, because in that moment, they remember what the world taught them to forget, that they are not broken, that they are not alone, that they are not too much or too little, but exactly what was dreamed. and the river holds them in that truth. One woman, years ago, who had lost 3 children and nearly herself, stepped into the river and did not speak for hours. When she emerged, soaked and shivering, she said only, "She told me I do not have to carry everything." And no one asked what she meant, because they all understood. Ayaba does not appear as a vision. She does not part the water like prophets. She does not heal with lightning. She witnesses. She receives. She reminds. And the river carries her, because it too was made not to conquer, but to receive. It does not fight mountains. It moves around them. It does not argue with stone. It shapes it. So if you ever find yourself at the edge of a forest, where the trees lean together like sisters whispering, and the air smells of water and memory, step gently, step slowly, and listen, because if the river is moving, Ayaba is near, not to save you, not to explain, but to show you what you already carry, to remind you that you are not the wound. You are the water that flows around it. And even now, long after she has disappeared into myth, Ayaba moves beneath the surface, soft, unseen, sacred, the river that carries her, carries you too. There are voices that live in books, etched in ink, guarded by libraries, spoken through scholars. And then there are voices that live in the body, that pass through breath, through sweat, through pain and touch and silence. Ayaba's voice was always the second kind. She never claimed scripture. She never offered prophecy. She simply remained, woven into the women who bring life. The midwives, they were never called priestesses. They did not wear robes. They did not speak of heavens or hells. But they held something even the oldest gods could not. The threshold, the space between worlds, where flesh and spirit meet, where breath begins, where blood becomes blessing. And in that space, Ayaba waited, not as an overseer, but as memory. She did not walk into the birthing hut with thunder. She arrived in the pause between contractions, in the soft murmur of the midwife's chant, the one passed from grandmother to granddaughter, never written down, never fully understood, but always known. It began as a hum, low, steady, timeless. Sometimes it was the rhythm of a heartbeat, sometimes the breath of wind through tall grass. Sometimes it was no sound at all, only a vibration in the bones of the woman giving birth, as if something deep inside her recognized itself. In those moments, Ayaba was there, not to take credit, not to be named, but to remind the body what it already knew, how to open, how to release, how to let the veil between the worlds flutter and then close again. And the midwives? They never questioned it. They did not speak of her in the open, not during the years of fire and conquest, not during the decades of silence and forgetting, but in the still of night, as the village slept, and a woman screamed against the pain of becoming a gateway. They would lean close, press their lips to her ear, and whisper, "She is with you. Let go." Some say every midwife knows the moment Ayaba enters the room. The wind shifts. The oil in the clay bowl forms a perfect spiral. The child's heartbeat falters for just a second, then returns stronger. They feel her not as presence, but as permission. Permission to surrender. Permission to be divine in pain. Permission to remember what creation feels like. Because Ayaba's greatest miracle was never her birth. It was what she left behind. A legacy of knowing. Not in the mind, but in the womb. There's a story told in secret among the old midwives of a girl no older than 15, her body barely ready, her eyes wide with fear. The birth was long. The baby's head would not come. The hut filled with heat, with tension, with the hovering shadow of death. And then the midwife began to hum. Soft, simple, ancient, and suddenly the girl stilled. Her hands unclenched, her legs relaxed, and she whispered without knowing why. Ayaba. The child came moments later. Quiet, wide-eyed, alive. No prayers had been said. No God called down. Just that hum. And that name. Whispered like a secret too sacred for daylight. In time, even those who had forgotten the stories began to feel her. Doctors trained in concrete clinics, disconnected from the old songs, found themselves pausing mid-delivery, wondering why the room felt suddenly full. Women who had never heard her name felt their own hands move in patterns they had never been taught, rubbing backs, soothing brows, pressing palms to hips in time with contractions, because the body remembers what the mind forgets. And Ayaba had never been a god of temples. She had always been a god of touch, a breath, a birth, a becoming. So now, in villages and cities, in sacred huts and sterile rooms, she moves. She passes through the hands of midwives, who may not know her story, but carry her wisdom anyway. She is the whisper between contractions, the pause before the first cry, the hand that holds without needing to be seen. And every time a child is born, when the blood runs, when the veil lifts, when a new soul enters the world, Ayaba sings, not loudly, not with fanfare, but in the oldest song of all, the one that says, "You are here, you are enough, you are home." Long after the stories were forgotten by the world, long after maps replaced memory, and the air thickened with the noise of forgetting, there remained a few who remembered, not in words, but in bones. They are old now, old like driftwood, softened and shaped by decades of wind and time. You find them in quiet places, near the edge of the fields, on porches worn smooth by elbows and silence. They do not speak much. They do not interrupt. But if you sit long enough, if you wait without asking, without filling the air with your questions, they might give you something sacred, not with sentences, not with facts, but with a look, a single glance, piercing and soft, as if trying to decide whether you are still capable of remembering, because they remember her, not from stories, not from chance, but from the feeling beneath their feet. They remember the hum. They speak of a time when Ayaba walked the earth, not as a goddess robed in mystery, but as a girl with bare feet and steady breath, whose steps pressed the earth in a rhythm the soil had not felt in centuries. The rhythm of origin. One elder, a man with eyes the color of smoke and a spine curved like the crescent moon, once whispered, "I was a boy digging in the ground for yams. I looked up and saw her walking through the dust. She was barefoot. Her feet didn't raise dust. The dust followed her like it wanted to stay close." Another woman, her skin a map of time and her laughter rare as rain and drought, said, "We were told not to look, that she wasn't for our eyes. But I did, just once, and I saw the earth brighten beneath her step, like the ground remembered it was alive." They speak not of miracles. No fire from the sky, no rivers parted, only footsteps, soft, measured, infinite in meaning. Because when Ayaba walked, the world leaned in. The trees grew still. The birds hushed. Even the goats paused, chewing slower, heads tilted, as if listening for something just below the surface. They say the soil itself remembered her, that wherever she stepped, the ground retained her warmth. For hours, sometimes days, and women who walked after her found their hips looser, their pain eased. Men found their tempers dulled, their breath slower. The elders never tried to follow her. They knew better. Following was for gods who demanded. Ayaba never did. She did not call for disciples. She left imprints instead, in dirt, in rhythm, in the body's quiet awareness that something holy had passed this way. And now, decades later, those who walked after her do not speak her name aloud, not because they forgot, but because her name feels too alive, to be spoken by voices so close to the grave. Instead, they bow, not deep, not showy, a tilt of the head, a closing of the eyes, whenever the wind shifts without warning, whenever a child says something too wise for their age, whenever the rain falls on a cloudless day. They bow, because they know, because they remember, because their feet still feel the echo, in the very center of one village, on a path no longer used. There is a single stone, flat, worn smooth, ringed by weeds and forgotten by all but the oldest. No writing marks it, no shrine guards it, but the elders do not step on it. They walk around. They say that was where she last stood, years before the missionaries arrived, before the concrete, before the forgetting. The earth still hums there, not loudly, just enough. If you place your bare foot upon it, gently, respectfully, you might feel it too, a subtle vibration, not beneath the ground, but inside you, like something waiting, like someone remembering. And if you ask the elders about it, they won't answer. They will just smile, or look away, or close their eyes as if hearing music you cannot. Because Ayaba does not live in words. She lives in recognition. And those who once felt the world shift beneath her steps. Those who remember her in silence. Who bow without asking why. Know this. She never needed to be seen, only felt. And the earth, beneath all its scars, still carries the imprint of her feet. As do they, as do we. The desert hides what the forest whispers. It does not cradle memory the way rivers do. It buries, it silences, it strips things down to their bones and waits. Centuries, sometimes millennia, for someone brave enough or lost enough to listen. There's a place far from any village, where the dunes shift like sleeping giants and the wind carries the scent of iron and ash. No road leads there. No birds circle above it. But once, many years ago, a child, too curious to be called obedient, followed a trail of cracked earth and silence deep into the sand. He had no reason, only a feeling. Children often carry knowing that has not yet been named. And sometimes, that knowing leads them exactly where the forgotten things wait. He walked for a day and a night. His feet blistered, his lips cracked. No one knows what he ate. No one knows why he didn't turn back. But just before the second dawn, the ground beneath him gave way, and he fell into a hush, a tomb, swallowed by time. It was small, round, cool. The air inside did not feel dead. It felt suspended, as though the breath of the last person to enter had never left. In the center of the chamber, half buried beneath soft dust the color of bone, was a jar, not ornate, not royal, just clay, handmade. Its surface rippled with the fingerprint of the one who shaped it long ago. Inside it, salt, fine, white as moonlight, and something else. Tiny fragments, glints of shimmer, dust that glowed faintly even in darkness. The child reached in and brought a pinch to his tongue. It tasted like rain, like tears that were not sad, like the air before a storm that never came. And on the base of the jar, carved so faintly it could only be seen when the light struck at an angle, was the spiral. Not a perfect circle, not a symbol of empire, a single continuous line, like a breath that had nowhere to end. The mark of Ayaba. It wasn't signed. There were no words, but the child knew. He felt it, the same way the fireflies had once followed her hands, the same way the midwives knew when to hum. The salt, they say, was not just seasoning. It was memory, crystallized, preserved, a mineral that holds the sea within it, even after the ocean is gone. And mixed in that salt were tiny shards of mica, stone that catches light like eyes catching truth. The boy brought the jar home. His family didn't believe him. They laughed nervously. They took the jar and placed it behind the stove. too unsettled to throw it away. But that night, his grandmother, nearly blind, barely walking, touched it, and she wept, not from grief, not from fear. She wept the way the earth weeps when long-awaited rain falls, quietly, completely, gratefully, because she had once heard the stories, not from her mother, not even from her grandmother, but from the wind in her bones. She took the jar in her lap and held it to her chest, and whispered, "I thought we had forgotten you." She told no one what she meant. She died weeks later, but before she passed, she dipped her fingers in the salt, pressed them to the boy's forehead, and said, "You carry her now." That boy grew up to speak very little. He worked with his hands. He learned to listen, and though he never returned to that tomb, never again found the crack in the sand where memory had opened, he began to walk with the same quiet grace that others noticed but could not explain. When he touched clay, the pots seemed warmer. When he walked through markets, birds circled him briefly. When he stood alone under the moon, his breath misted even in the dry heat, as though the air recognized him. The jar still exists. It sits on a shelf in a house made of red earth, untouched by museums, unclaimed by historians. Its salt never clumps, its shimmer never fades, and the spiral, though faint, can still be traced by finger in the right light. It is not proof, it is not artifact, it is offering, because some truths are not preserved in temples. Some are hidden in jars, in sand, in the small hands of a child who does not yet know he has stepped into myth. An Ayaba who was never meant to be worshipped, only remembered, smiles in the hush between salt and shimmer. She lives still, in the places no one thinks to look, in tombs that are not graves, but wombs of memory, waiting to open. Some dreams do not begin in the mind. They begin in the womb, before language, before breath, before separation. There are girls born across villages, towns, cities that do not remember the names of their rivers anymore. Girls who carry a strange quiet inside them, like a song their mothers forgot to finish. They do not speak often. They stare at the moon too long. They listen when no one is speaking. And when they sleep, they dream of light, but not sunlight, not fire, not electric glow. They dream of a soft, pulsing radiance, a silver warmth that wraps itself around them, like a shawl woven from river wind and ash. They cannot describe it. They don't try, because they know, deep down, that to speak of it would thin it, would turn something sacred into something explainable. And Ayaba was never meant to be explained. She was meant to be felt. These girls don't belong to any one place. Some are born in mud huts, some in hospitals with fluorescent lights, some in cities where the air never fully sleeps. But they all carry the same dream. They wake up breathless, sometimes with tears, sometimes with their fingers curled in patterns they don't recognize. Their mothers worry. Their fathers dismiss. Their teachers label them as distracted, slow, too quiet. But the old women, those who still sweep the yards with brooms made of memory, recognize the signs. They gather the girls on quiet afternoons, offer them roasted groundnuts in silence, and wait. Eventually, one of the girls will speak. Not loudly, not proudly. She will say something like, "There was a woman made of breath. She looked at me, and I felt like I remembered something before I was born." And the old women will nod and say nothing more, because they too dreamed of her once, before time turned dreams into duty, before their own mothers taught them to look down, to stay small, to pray to gods who did not have their eyes or their blood. These girls who dream of light, they do not ask for Ayaba. They simply know her, in the way their fingers move in spirals when they are anxious, in the way they hum without melody as they fall asleep, in the way they find comfort not in crowds, but in trees, in water, in the hush of twilight. Some are afraid of what they carry. They feel too much. They weep too easily. They walk with one foot always somewhere else. And the world, which fears softness that doesn't beg for approval, tries to press them into smaller shapes. But Ayaba reaches for them in dreams. She does not appear as a goddess. She does not shine. She sits beside them, barefoot, wrapped in shawls of smoke and clay. Her hands open, her breath slow, her silence louder than any sermon. And in that silence, the girls remember that they are not fragile. They are thresholds. They are carriers of something that was almost lost. Each of them holds a thread of the old story. Each of them is a living altar, unmarked, unclaimed, unburnable. They will grow. Some will become mothers, some lovers. Some will never speak of Ayaba again, but she will remain in them, in the way they listen, in the way they grieve without shame, in the way they let others fall apart in their presence, without needing to fix, only to hold. And when they hum to their own daughters, those same strange, soft songs with no words, Ayaba will return again, not as myth, not as memory, but as legacy, because she never needed temples. She only needed dreamers, girls who could carry light without explanation, girls who didn't bow, but breathed, so the world may forget her name, but it will never stop dreaming of her, not as long as there are girls who close their eyes and see her sitting quietly in the dark, waiting, whole, and full of the light we have not yet learned how to name. Some symbols are not drawn. They emerge from fire, from sleep, from the water left behind after birth. And among them, one endures, not in books, not on tablets, but in the curve of rivers, in the swirl of cowrie shells, in the patient unfolding of ferns. The spiral. It is not owned by any one culture. It has no author. It simply appears again and again, whenever the soul reaches for something older than memory, before language carved edges into truth, before kings flattened the sacred into scripture, before gods had names that could be recited or denied. There was only motion, and the first motion was turning, spiraling, not forward, not backward, but inward. It is said that Ayaba did not write her name. She breathed it once into the shape of the spiral, not for others to read, but for the world to remember. And so the spiral became her secret, her echo, her fingerprint. The women who bore witness to her presence, those who walked the birthing fields barefoot, who stirred the cooking pots clockwise, who washed the feet of the dying, knew it by instinct. They drew it in ashes when no one watched, etched it into clay when shaping pots, braided it into their daughters' hair before sending them out into the world. Always the same motion, a gentle turn, a slow inward pull, a whisper that becomes a center. But with time, the spiral was buried. By rules, by doctrine, by the fear of things that could not be controlled. The colonizers saw it carved into the mud walls of homes, painted onto the knees of dancers, woven into baskets without corners. And they erased it, labeled it pagan, labeled it meaningless, not realizing it was a map. Because the spiral does not explain. It remembers. It reminds us that nothing begins only once. That birth and death are not separate. That time does not march in a line, but folds like breath into breath. The midwives knew it. They traced it onto the backs of women in labor, so that their pain might move in rhythm, so that their bodies would remember what their minds had been made to forget, that they already knew the way through. The elders remembered it, when they stirred medicine, when they sang over wounds, when they danced at dusk in circles that never closed. Even the children knew. They traced it in dust, doodled it in the margins of their notebooks, spun in circles when no one was looking, as if trying to find their center again. But no one named it Ayaba, because they didn't have to. She was there in the motion, in the rhythm of water circling a stone, in the way fire sways before it collapses inward, in the way a baby curls in the womb. Not in angles, but in soft, perfect coils. The spiral endured, not as icon, but as invitation, a call back to wholeness. And in scattered places across the continent, far from cities, far from the noise of forgetting, the spiral still waits, carved into the underside of a mother's drum, etched into the last spoon a grandmother used before she returned to the soil, drawn in the sand by a girl who dreams of light. There are no temples for it, no priest to guard it, no text to interpret it, only hands and breath, and the old, slow memory of turning inward. Because Ayaba was never the center. She was the turning, the curve, the invitation, the quiet reminder that nothing holy is ever far, only forgotten. And the spiral remains where she left it, in the dust, in the salt, in the wrist of a midwife, in the rhythm of a child's hum, waiting to be traced again, waiting for someone, anyone, to remember not who she was, but how she moved. All stories have an ending, even the ones that live in breath, even the ones that are never written, even those whispered from mother to daughter across generations of silence. But Ayaba did not end. She returned. To where? No one knows. Some say she dissolved into the sky. Some say the river carried her whole into its bend and never gave her back. And others claim she became a tree, growing in reverse, roots above, leaves below, drinking memory instead of rain. But what all agree on is this: the morning she left was not like any other. It began before dawn, before the cocks crowed, before the children stirred in sleep. There was a stillness in the air that had weight, as if the earth had pulled its breath inward. The stars did not twinkle. The wind did not rustle. Even the dogs, those eternal barkers of the in-between, laid down their heads without knowing why. Ayaba rose from her mat, as she always did, folded her shawl, washed her hands in the cold water left from the night before. She lit no fire. She left no mark, but the ground where her bare feet stepped was warm long after. A child glimpsed her walking toward the edge of the village, where the forest meets the mist, and called out to her. She did not turn. The child later said she seemed both lighter and heavier, as if the air held her and the world pulled her back all at once. She wore no crown. She carried no bag, only her silence, only her name, still unwritten. The women in the village woke and felt it instantly. Not grief, not absence, but a kind of hollowing, as though a space had been carved open between the ribs of the world. They did not speak of it. They gathered water. They pounded millet. They tended goats. But all day, they glanced toward the tree line, again and again, waiting for something they could not name. By afternoon, the spiral she had traced each morning in the dust beside her hut had faded. By dusk, the birds had still not sung. By nightfall, the fireflies gathered, hundreds of them, not in the fields, not by the river, but above the baobab tree where she had once been found. They hovered in a perfect spiral, glowing, spinning, silent, and in that light, one of the eldest women, whose eyes were clouded but whose memory was not, stood beneath the tree and spoke. She has been called. That was all. Not by the gods, not by death, not by duty, but by something older than all three. The sky, the very fabric from which she had once drawn her breath. The canvas she had descended from as a whisper had turned its face to her again, not as a summons, but as a welcome. And she had gone. There was no burial, no mourning, no shrine, only space, only the spiral in the soil that would not form again, only the hush. Years passed, and people came asking for her. Scholars, pilgrims, men with scrolls and questions. They stood beneath the tree. They sifted the dust. They asked over and over, Where did she go? Who was she? What was her purpose? But the villagers only shook their heads, because they knew you cannot explain a breath once it has returned to the wind. You cannot point to where a spiral ends. Some say Ayaba rose into the sky on a ladder made of silence. Others say she folded herself into a star, one so faint it can only be seen when you stop trying. But those who loved her, truly without needing to know why, simply say, she is not gone. She is everywhere we forgot to look. And on certain dawns, when the light bends just right, when the fire is still unlit, and the birds hold their song for just one moment longer, the air feels full. And if you listen, not with ears, but with the place behind your breath, you might hear the world exhale, slow and whole, and feel a presence beside you, barefoot, unspoken, still, because Ayaba did not leave. She was called, and the sky, remembering her name, finally had room to receive her. After Ayaba vanished into the hush of morning, after the last firefly spiraled away into the folds of dusk, what she left behind was not relic or ruin. It was clay, not a sculpture, not a monument, but the memory of shaping. You see, clay is not a finished thing. It is potential, a waiting, a listening. And in many places across the land, especially in the quiet corners where the wind speaks more often than people do, there are those who still understand this. They do not call themselves sculptors. They do not work for markets or kings. They are women, mostly, elders with cracked hands, girls with bare feet and skirts dusted with earth, boys who sit beneath trees and press their thumbs into soil, without knowing they are remembering something ancient. They shape the clay not to create, but to remember. They do it slowly, in circles, with breath, no molds, no knives, just fingers, soft, deliberate, listening fingers. They begin with the spiral, always the spiral, drawn first with the tip of the middle finger, clockwise, then inward. Then they pause, not to think, but to feel, as if waiting for the clay to speak. And sometimes it does. It shapes itself into bowls, into tiny figures, into flat discs with symbols no one taught them, but that they always knew. And always it fits perfectly into the palm, because the palm is where we first touched the world. The palm is where we first received. And Ayaba, they say, lives now in the spaces we shape when we're not trying. One village elder tells a story of how, after Ayaba left, a girl no older than 8 sat beneath the baobab and began to form little figurines, not of animals, not of gods, but of gestures, a cupped hand, a bowed head, a foot stepping forward, a pair of lips slightly parted. The elder watched in silence for hours, and when the girl was done, she lined the figures up in the dust and whispered. She asked me to finish her story. No one corrected her, because they could see these were not toys. They were fragments, echoes, and the clay had remembered. In a city far from any forest, a woman who had never heard of Ayaba took a pottery class. Her hands trembled. She said she had never made anything before, but as the wheel turned beneath her palms, she found herself shaping a form she couldn't describe. It was not quite a vessel, not quite a figure, but it moved. It curved inward like a question and rose again like breath. When she was done, her teacher asked what it was, and she said, "I think it's something I used to know," and placed it gently in her palm. These things still happen. Not often, but enough. In the hands of potters who hum without knowing why. In the way children shape mud when no one is watching. In the places where the earth is wet and the air is quiet. The clay still holds Ayaba, because she was never meant to be remembered in stone. Stone is final, unmoving, cold. Ayaba was never finished. She was always becoming. And so she left herself behind in clay, in the things that are formed slowly, with care, with breath, with grief. She left herself in the process, not the product. And in every palm that touches clay, in every thumb that presses gently into a spiral, she returns, not to speak, not to rule, but to remind that we are not here to build monuments. We are here to shape, to soften, to mold what we do not yet understand, and to let it rest, still warm, in our open hands, because the hands remember. They always have. Names have always been more than labels. In the beginning, to speak a name was to summon its essence, to call something or someone into the shape of presence. But Ayaba's name was different. It was not carved into stone. It was not passed down in scripts or scrolls. It was not shouted over battlefields or sewn into priestly robes. Her name was made of smoke, because smoke, like truth, cannot be held. It curls, it vanishes, it lingers, and yet it carries with it the scent of what once was. What burned? What breathed? What dared to become ash? In a small village nestled at the foot of the Red Hills, there is a ritual no one teaches. There is no book, no announcement, just a time of year when the winds change and the air thickens with remembering. On that night, women gather. Not many, sometimes only 3, sometimes more. They bring with them bundles of dried leaves, bitter bark, river grass, pressed petals still stained with the dust of women who once walked barefoot through fields of unharvested dreams. They sit in silence, not out of solemnity, but out of invitation. The fire is lit slowly, a small flame, unimpressive. It does not roar. It waits. Then the leaves are laid into it, not thrown, not fed, but offered. And as they begin to burn, the smoke rises. It does not swirl like ordinary fire. It spells, not in letters, not in language, but in curves, in spirals, in shapes that evoke breath, hips, wombs, wind. There is a moment when all the women lean forward, not to inhale, but to remember, because in the shape of that smoke, they feel her. Ayaba, not her face, not her voice, her presence. Faint, warm, close. They do not speak her name aloud. It is not meant for mouths anymore. It is meant for nerves, for the place in the body where longing meets knowing, where silence becomes prayer without words. One elder describes it this way. The smoke spells her name in my chest. It curves behind my ribs and rests there. I don't read it. I feel it. And when I exhale, it's as if she's breathing through me. Sometimes the fire goes out without warning. Not from wind, not from rain, but because it is done, because she has passed through, because something has been remembered. The younger women at first don't understand. They squint at the smoke. They try to find patterns. They ask, what does it mean? The elders smile. They hand them another bundle of leaves and say, stop trying to read her. Let her read you. Because Ayaba's name is not for speaking. It is for feeling. It lives in the scent that clings to your hair long after the fire has gone out. It lives in the sudden silence between verses, in the tear that rises not from pain, but from recognition. And when you walk home after the smoke, barefoot, quiet, alone, you carry her, not as story, not as myth, but as ember, as the truth that never burned bright enough to blind, but always burned steady enough to guide. They say that if you close your eyes on one of those nights, and the fire is just right, and the smoke curls with intention, you might feel her name brush the inside of your throat. Not a word, but a sound. Not call, but a return. And you will know she's still with us. Everywhere, nowhere, in the fire, in the ash, in the breath that remembers its source. Ayaba, the name that cannot be spoken, only lit, only released. There are melodies that are never heard, yet always known. Songs that do not pass through the years, but move through marrow, like a tide that doesn't crash, but pulls softly at the bones. Ayaba's last gift, some say, was not a word, nor a story, nor a symbol. It was a song, but no one has ever heard it, not in the way we understand hearing. There is no pitch, no key, no syllables to mimic, yet it is the one song every soul seems to know, especially those closest to becoming, those teetering at the edge of birth, or grief, or awakening. The elders call it the song without sound. It cannot be taught. It cannot be performed. It can only be felt, and only when you're not trying. The first time most people encounter it, they think it is sorrow. It rises unexpectedly, in kitchens while peeling root vegetables, in gardens beneath the weight of summer sun, in moments when silence stretches too long and stills everything but breath. It comes as a vibration, not on the skin, but inside, a soft hum just under the ribs, like a voice from deep water, calling without language. Midwives often hear it as birth approaches, not when the child crowns, but in that suspended moment between final push and first cry, a stillness so complete it aches. Dancers feel it when they lose the beat and move without counting, when a body takes over and the self dissolves into gesture. Mourners hear it beside graves, not from mouths, but from the air, as if the earth itself is singing the soul home. And children, especially the quiet ones, hum it without knowing. They sway to it when no music is playing. They look toward empty corners and smile. They curl into the crook of their mother's arm and sigh, as if something has just finished singing to them. Some say this song was once sung aloud, when the world was soft, when trees had tongues, and rivers remembered names. But when Ayaba left, she took the voice with her, and left only the resonance, a tone that remains, not in the air, but in us. There are villages where women still gather in circles, not to sing, but to listen together. They sit with hands on their bellies, or their chests, or holding the hands of daughters not yet old enough to name their knowing. And they sway, eyes closed, mouths closed, hearts wide open. No song plays, no note rises, but their bodies respond. A shoulder drops, a breath deepens, a tear falls, and no one asks, what is wrong? Because nothing is wrong. Something is simply being remembered. The song, they say, is not for the ears. It's for the wound beneath the wound, the one that carries the forgetting of origin, the one that was born not from harm, but from separation. Ayaba's song bridges that space, not with words, not with melody, but with a presence that asks nothing but this. Do you remember how whole you once were? And the body answers, not with voice, but with movement, with shiver, with release. Even now, the song without sound drifts through markets, through labor rooms, through the hush before a kiss, through the breath before a prayer. It is not an anthem. It is not sacred text. It is the music that comes before sound, before language, before even self. It is the place where Ayaba still sings. And if you are very still, still enough to feel your own heartbeat soften, still enough to forget who you were trying to be, you might hear it too. Or rather, you might remember that you already know it, because the song without sound was never meant to be heard. It was meant to awaken. All endings are false, if they are told with certainty. Ayaba never truly ended. She only dissolved, into memory, into motion, into the kind of knowing that resists words, but lives faithfully in the gestures we never question. A hand on a swollen belly, a sigh released without shame, a spiral drawn absent-mindedly in the dust. She did not leave behind relics to be guarded, no bones to be buried, no lineage to be defended. She left behind what cannot be stolen. Presence, the kind that drapes itself across the body in moments of deep silence. that rises with steam from a cooking pot, that folds itself into dreams, not as image, but as rhythm. What remains of her is not found in museums or carved into rock. It is in motion, in breath, in remembrance, because Ayaba was not a woman, not entirely. She was not a goddess, not exactly. She was an invitation to pause, to soften, to remember the body not as vessel, but as story. And that story still lives, not in books, but in bodies, in the women who laugh with their full mouths, who cry without apology, who dance barefoot in rooms that no one else understands, in the children who hum tunes with no origin, in the grandmothers who sit in doorways with eyes half closed, as if watching a world no one else can see, in the men who do not fear gentleness, who weep beside birthbeds, who hold silence without needing to fill it, in the lovers who trace spirals into each other's backs, in the midwives who hum before the child crowns, in the hands that shape clay without design, but with deep listening. Ayaba remains, not because she was declared divine, but because she was never denied it. She lived divinity without armor. She breathed it into river water, into the curve of hips, into the space between contraction and cry. She lives now, in the cracks, in the soft places the world has not yet paved over, in the hush just before morning, in the glance exchanged between women who have never met, but know instantly that they carry the same old song. Some ask where she went. They say, how can someone so powerful simply vanish? But Ayaba did not vanish. She returned to where all things true eventually return, into the pulse, into the silence, into the knowing that does not require proof. What still remains is not what she did, but what she woke up in us, the spiral drawn in the sand, still fresh after the wind, the heartbeat we find when the noise finally stops, the way we look at the moon and feel both seen and unnamed. That is Ayaba, and so the story does not end, because as long as someone sits quietly beside a river, or touches their own skin with reverence, or listens for a song that can't be heard, she remains, not as history, not as myth, but as presence, still soft, still breathing, still guiding us home,